in 1990, October, that Yugoslavia faced breakup, probably violent, as early as 6 months from the time of the report. And nobody paid any attention to it in the higher echelons of government.
By June of 1991, however, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker decided to make one attempt to prevent a disaster. He flew to Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia, to confront leaders of the 6 republics.
He said, don't any of you take steps that are not agreed on by the others.
However, Milan Kucan and Franjo Tudjman, leaders of the Slovenian and Croatian republics, were confident that they could ignore the U.S. Secretary of State. They declared their independence just days later, on June 25th, because they could count on the support of German Foreign Minister Genscher and Austrian Foreign Minister Alois Mock. The cycle of violence which would destroy Yugoslavia began when Slovene President Milan Kucan ordered his troops to seize customs posts on the Yugoslav borders with Austria and Italy, and the Slovene capital of Ljubljana. Yugoslav flags were taken down and replaced with Slovenian flags.
And the Slovenes thought they had a right to take down those flags. The end of an internationally recognized frontier. And I don't think that for a moment Belgrade expected there would be violent resistance.
To avoid violence, Yugoslav Army General Andrija Rašeta had phoned Milan Kucan privately to let him know that many Yugoslav Army troops responding to this challenge of federal authority were not even carrying live ammunition.
But in fact, the Slovenes had prepared themselves. They were getting a lot of encouragement from across the way, from Vienna and from the Germans too. And they foresaw that they could make a very big international case by having what they called a war of independence. It was nothing of the sort.
German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher flew to the Austrian border with Yugoslavia to join President Kucan and warned the Federal Army against efforts to maintain control of federal borders. Kucan ordered his forces to fire on Yugoslav Army troops, including those who carried no live ammunition. Faced with international opposition led by Germany, Yugoslav President Markovic ordered the Federal Army to withdraw from Slovenia without a serious attempt to counter separatist forces. Slovene leaders conducted a masterful public relations effort. Foreign reporters were kept occupied in an underground press center with briefings that suggested that Slovene forces had defeated the 4th largest army in Europe. Journalists in the press center routinely reported as news fanciful briefings from Slovene officials on various battles, including some that had never happened.
What was going on in Slovenia, where the Slovenians declared independence and set up customs posts on the road, tended to be seen and portrayed on television as the Yugoslav army acting aggressively against Slovenia as opposed to the Slovenians declaring independence.
The manipulation of the Foreign Press Corps set the tone for new wars of secession in Croatia and Bosnia. Repeatedly, the JNA was described as an occupying force dominated by Serbs. The reality was different, however. The Army's Chief of Staff, Veljko Kadijević, was half Croatian, half Serb. Air Force Chief Zvonko Jurjević was Croatian, and the commander of the Navy, Stane Brovec, was Slovenian.
And the Federal Army had held Yugoslavia together under Tito without creating any protests about human rights. Tito insisted on an ethnic balance, and in the localities it was composed of the people of that area. It was absurd to call it an army of occupation. And we, the West, should have recognized it until there was an agreed arrangement for a dissolution of a state which had been Yugoslavia and which might take years or decades or perhaps be impossible. Until then, it had to be recognized these were the internationally recognized frontiers.
If German and Austrian leaders still believed that Slovenia and Croatia could be separated from Yugoslavia without a wider war, the Americans strongly believed otherwise.
Because we said, if Yugoslavia does not break up peacefully, there's going to be one hell of a civil war. It nevertheless broke up non-peacefully. It broke up through the unilateral declaration of independence by Slovenia and Croatia, and the seizing by these two countries, republics, of their border posts, which was an act of force and which was an act that was in violation of the Helsinki principles. But the European powers and the United States ultimately recognized Slovenia and then Croatia and then Bosnia as independent countries and admitted them to the United Nations. The real problem was that there was a unilateral declaration of independence and a use of force to gain that independence rather than a peaceful negotiation of independence, which is the way it should have happened.
While most of Europe, including England, France, and Russia, opposed the breakup of Yugoslavia, only the Americans were strong enough to oppose Germany. In a decision that would have far-reaching consequences, however, the Americans decided to back away from this challenge. George Kenney, who would later resign in protest over policy, was running the U.S. State Department's Yugoslavia desk at the time.
Our marching orders were to keep the U.S. out, to avoid taking any responsibility for a solution to the conflict. The analysts could see that the problem would get a lot worse. They also saw that the Europeans weren't going to be able to handle it.
Historically, the United States had supported a multi-ethnic Yugoslavia over a 70-year period to stabilize the region and serve as a barrier to German expansion. In reality, Yugoslavia, a union of South Slavic peoples, would never have come together in 1918 without American support from U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. For centuries, the region had been colonized by Austro-Hungary and the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The Austrians, under the Habsburg monarchy, used a policy of divide and rule to maintain control, keeping the Slovenes, Croatians, Serbs, and Muslims at each other's throats, instead of uniting them in their common interests.
The Habsburg Empire kept going and held down a large part of what we tend to call Yugoslavia. There was no possibility of a Slav get-together until after the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and the peoples came together and decided to unite.
With American support, Yugoslavia was founded in 1918 and survived German attempts to divide it up during World War II. When Yugoslavia's communist leader Josip Broz Tito broke away from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in 1948, the U.S. stepped in with military assistance as well as international loans to prop up a buffer state between the West and the communist-dominated Warsaw Pact. As the Cold War came to an end, however, Washington declared a new world order which emphasized economic competition rather than anti-communism.
So once that containment of the Soviet Union began to disappear as a need with the decline after mid-'80s, Gorbachev's economic reforms, the NATO-Warsaw Pact talks about reducing arms and force buildup, all of that led to Yugoslavia being essentially irrelevant in its defense posture. And by early 1989, the Americans were really quite explicit. The new ambassador to Yugoslavia from the United States informed the Yugoslav government that the Yugoslav position was no longer needed, that Yugoslavia was no longer strategically important to the United States and Western defense.
Yugoslavia had become expendable. International loans were called in, causing triple-digit inflation. The federal government